everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. Boxing history time, my friends, as always, which means I'm here with my dude, Aris Pina, CompuBox operator, and also just a fellow fight history maniac like myself. Aris, what's up, bro? How are you?
Doing good, my friend. How's everything on your end?
Doing all right, man. You know, I wish that we did not have to talk about something a little bit somber and sad to begin the show, because we do have some more fun stuff after that. But unfortunately, yesterday we learned that esteemed referee and really boxing icon Mills Lane passed away. So we had to say a little something. You know, we got to say something.
Absolutely, man. Mills Lane is one of those guys that he was an icon in the sport, absolutely, and an all-time great referee. But even more so than that, Mills Lane somehow, as a boxing referee, I mean, he was a colorful personality, but he transformed into sort of like a pop icon, pop culture icon in the late '90s, which is interesting because that was like mainly crash television. That was like WWE, the Jerry Springer era, like a lot of crazy shit going on, and The and in boxing, it seemed like Mills Lane was always in the center of all the crazy shit was going down. I mean, he was a great referee. He was a former fighter from early on. He almost made the 1960 Olympic team, which meant he would have been on the same team with Muhammad Ali, Wilbert Skeeter McClure, Eddie Crook, guys, very solid, esteemed class. Anyways, so he had a very solid amateur career, former Marine, just a no frills, very tough guy. They didn't take shit from anybody, and even though he was small in stature, people whoop your ass. Like, just always, took care of himself. And then that translated into the ring, because like he was a guy that wouldn't take shit from anybody. And even though he was small, his specialty was heavyweights. He worked every division. He worked a number of Julian Jackson fights. If you watch the highlights of Jackson's knocking out guys into another orbit, Mills is usually the one collecting the pieces after that. But
Well, Jackson fought in Nevada so many times, and it's like, you know, Mills was just all around
always
Nevada.
there, totally, totally. And but Mills's specialty, it seemed, was always heavyweights. You know what I mean? And he was always, especially in the '90s. His first big fight, of course, was Larry Holmes versus Jerry Cooney. And that being such a big event and everything like that, I think that was the time when he first came up with the coin the monkey or let's get it on, because he knew he needed to just say something to set up the event and all that, and just knew what was the atmosphere and how big of an event this actually was. It was one of the biggest ones of all time, still remains that way. And but after that fight, he remained. Go ahead.
Was he the first one? Was he the first referee to have? I'm pretty sure he was the first one to like coin a phrase, right? Because that was right around the time when, like, right after that, all of them started trying to come up with their own job. Fair but firm. You remember
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I
yeah,
say, you
yeah.
must obey, and all this type of shit. And it was like, man, you guys are getting it. You guys are getting a little out there now. You're just like looking for rhymes and shit to
Totally.
say.
And that was one
But
of the
he
first.
started it.
Absolutely. Not only that, I think he was, like you said, he started it, and he also did a thing when he was being announced in the ring. If you notice, one went like this nose, and I remember when people asked him about that, that was him saying hello to either his family or somebody, a friend or whoever it was. But he would always do that to reference them, and so
It's like
um,
Carol Burnett used to do that on her show. She used to tug her ear. Yeah.
there's always like a little thing people would do to kind of like reference family members or let them know what's going on television. But yeah, by the '90s, that's when Mills like really started like coming into the atmosphere, not only just boxing, but like being known outside of the sport too, because he was always in the center of crazy shit. It just happened to be that way. For example, Fan Man, Bo Holyfield, the second Bo Holyfield fight. Imagine being the third man in the ring and seeing that crazy ass paraglider dude coming down from there, crashing through the scepter, and then you have to be at the center of that to command all attention, stop the fight, and try to make sure all hell doesn't break loose, which was just about to break loose.
Dude, it always seemed in, like, with the 90s too, there was always some shit going on. Like, and
Yeah,
there were so many crazy things that happened just like overall. And it always seemed like wherever you looked, like that's he was there. He was almost always involved in some shit, you know. It was pretty amazing. But yeah, I think that also what's pretty much equally as amazing as how famous he became and how big a celebrity he became, celebrity death match. You know what I mean? Like he had his own thing on there. He was voicing that for a while until he got ill. in the early 2000s. You know, he was a cultural phenomenon, not just in boxing, but outside of boxing too. But even before that, a lot of the stuff that people don't know is really amazing too. Like you mentioned that he had fought earlier on and he almost made it to the 1960 Olympics. He won the NCAA welterweight championship 1960, and winning the NCAA welterweight championship then qualified him for the Olympic trials. And
Mhm.
so he didn't wind up going farther, but nonetheless, you know, he was a high ranking amateur at welterweight. You know, and that was after his stint in the Marines. So yeah, and on top of that, I'm this is not a book plug at all, but just because I learned a lot about him in order to write about Reno, to learn about the Reno boxing scene and stuff like that for the book about Oscar Bonavena. But he was involved in not just a bunch of legal stuff there, but he was involved in a bunch of boxing shit in Reno too. When boxing was just kind of first starting to come about or whatever in Reno, the scene was not very big, especially because Las Vegas was not that far away, and Las Vegas was flourishing in a different way. And in any case, you know, uh, that mob story with Oscar Bonavena and Joe Conforte, Mills Lane was actually one of the prosecutors who was involved in the Joe Conforte case and trying to figure out what happened to Oscar Bonavena, who killed him, what for, etc. And he was one of, just to kind of circle it back around to his character, to Mills Lane's character. He was an honest dude. He was a no nonsense dude. I'm not going to say he always made the correct call, but nonetheless, he was honest about the calls that he made and why. And just like in boxing, during that case, when everybody's trying to figure out what the fuck happened to Oscar Bonavena, and it started to really come to light how dirty Reno was as a result of its involvement with Joe Conforte. Mills Lane was basically put on this case, but the people that put him on the case like limited his power. And he
Mhm.
was like, well, if you're going to put me on this fucking case, you're going to need to give me, like, I'm going to need to fucking call a grand jury for this. I'm going to need to subpoena this person. I need these records. And they were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're just trying to give the appearance that we want to find out here, you know? Because I think that the whole point was that as people started understanding how deep Joe Conforte's involvement in Reno was, they were like, holy shit, like everybody looks bad. And Mills Lane didn't care. He wanted to just he wanted to do the job he was told to do. And he was honest about it. And he was basically like, look, dude, I'm being handcuffed here. I
Mhm.
can't do this. And he said, and he went to reporters and said that shit. He wasn't afraid to, you know, to say what it was, whereas a lot of people really hush hush about it, and that's how Mills Lane was. So it's really unfortunate that not only did we lose that yesterday, but we really lost it about 20 years ago when he had a stroke in 2002, and he lost a lot of his, you know, abilities to communicate, and he needed
I
to be
said it
taken care of. What's
was
that?
really I said it was sudden too because he was still very vibrant before that. Like he had his promotional company, he had the television show. I think he was already retired as a referee at that point, wasn't he?
I think so, yeah.
Well, he was still active.
Yeah, he was still active doing like he was a judge, like a judge, like not just, you know, and
Not
you
just a
talked about
celebrity.
that earlier, like a bunch of celebrities around this time started doing all their dude, they like were fucking Mills Lanes was a was like a trendsetter, bro. This fool was a pioneer. So, yeah, a lot of other people after he was had his judge show started trying to do the same thing, not realizing that he was like an actual judge. Like, you know, he like knew law and shit. He wasn't just some guy who's a celebrity. So yeah, boxing icon, somebody who definitely was bigger than the bouts he refereed, bigger
Yes.
than the things that he accomplished as an amateur and a pro fighter too. So it's a loss for the sport for sure.
Very much so, man. And condolences to his family. My buddies Terry and Tommy, his two kids, who over the years after Mills, took ill, or the whole family. I mean, they just did an amazing job taking care of him and just making sure he was as comfortable as he could be over the years and all that. And the year Mills got inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame, I unfortunately couldn't attend that year. But you know, even though he was ailing and everything like that, Mills was still very vibrant. He was very proud to be there, and he was even signing autographs and like just being active. You
Yeah,
know.
he still seemed like he was pushing it to like
Oh yeah,
everything he can do,
totally.
you know? I mean, which that just sounds like what you would expect.
Yeah. And you know, his two boys too, Terry and Tommy, they have some incredible stories of as they were just young kids and they used to travel with their dad. Imagine that. Mills Lane is your dad, and you're traveling all over the country for big paper, you know, big events that he was gonna work, and you're just there meeting everybody. That was their childhood. So
Yeah, the stuff that we're talking about, like they're roughly our age. So
yeah,
the things that we saw, you know, they probably saw far more firsthand or a lot more close up or the
absolutely.
aftermath and stuff like that.
I
So
think they're at the bite fight actually. I have to ask them again, but I think they might have been at the bite fight, which is
wild stuff, dude.
and I posted that. I posted a video yesterday about that where Mills was being interviewed immediately after the fight. And you know, it's most famous one of his most famous.
Ah, bullshit.
Yeah, because he said that to Tyson, bullshit, and you bet him, you know, right after that. But I had never seen this clip until yesterday because I just Googled Mills Lane bullshit and then this came up. And it was this goofy reporter. Why don't you stop the fight? All like incredulously. And Mills has the best comment. He just looks at him. He was like, how many times should a man get bit? He was like, there's a limit. He was like, a
There's
goddamn
a
limit,
limit to every
you know?
even
Just so
especially even
matter of
bites.
like it was almost like he's scolding one of his kids. It's a goddamn limit to everything, you know, including bites. Like matter of fact, like what the fuck do you mean, dude? You want me to just let it go? He got bit twice. What else am I gonna do?
It's like I'm like in the garage doing the laundry and my wife walks in and she's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like,
What?
"What the fuck else would I be doing standing in front of the washing machine?" You know, it's like the same shit. You know, like, what?
Basically,
Why did you stop the fight?
why wouldn't I
What?
stop the fight? What? Want me to
Yeah.
get up? You
What?
stupid asshole! Like you almost felt like Mills wanted to slap him for that comment. Like he didn't even look at him. He looked at him incredulously, answered him, and pointed at him, and
He's like,
then
"Oh, you really want me to speak to you like you're 6? I will."
and then when the guy was like, "Well, what about the headbutt?" He was like, "Bullshit, unintentional bullshit. I call that as that," and then he just ignored him after that. I mean, he
Dude.
was just that was a crazy time because I don't was this all the same year? You had the Lewis, you had the Lewis McCall second the second fight fiasco when McCall had the nervous breakdown, and Mills was the referee for that one. You had Tyson Holyfield, and then you had Lewis Akinwande, and Mills was the referee for that one too. People forget that fight because it was just so
Oh,
awful.
dude.
But he was
So bizarre. Like he would not let go.
no,
Mills was like,
yeah, and he Mills, and it's such a funny scene because poor Mills is so tiny, and you see it between these two
he's
Goliaths,
like
and he's just
screaming at him, "Let go, let go, let
ah,
go."
damn it, just let him go.
Like, oh my
Finally, and Mills,
God.
you just see he just his head is about to explode. Mills Lane, that is. And he's like, "Fuck
Yeah,
this!" And he's
I
about to
just
go.
don't think I've ever even seen anything like that before or
Oh,
since where somebody just wouldn't let go. Like,
and so I don't even know how he was able to keep on going for a few more years after that. Because in all honesty, Pat, if I had to go through that type of trauma in 1 year in major fights, I'm not sure if I'd want to go with that in my career. I'm pretty sure I'd be jinxed.
I would definitely be questioning, like, is it me? Like, is this
I bring
me?
this energy? Like, what is this? You
Yeah,
know?
what is this? And that's another crazy thing, dude, before we move on, is that like you're talking about his specialty was heavyweights. And I
Mhm.
remember like when they matched Lewis and Tyson. I know, but when they matched Lewis and Tyson in 2002, they're like, "Oh, you know, this has a lot of potential for getting out of hand. We need a big referee, you know, we need somebody who's like Jay Nady, who's like 6'6" or 6'4", or whatever he is, and big lurch, fucking idiot." And big fan here, big fan. But they're like, "Oh, we need a big referee and blah 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 who can handle this and stuff like that." But it's too bad that Mills Lane's not in there, so they wound up getting Eddie Cotton, who also himself was like a massive dude. He's like 6'7" or some shit. And so, point being that like that's a normal conversation for like big heavyweight fights. You know, like we need somebody who's physical, we need somebody who's big. Back in the day, it was like we need 5'6" Mills Lane.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5'6" former Marine Mills Lane who shoved Bernard Hopkins out of the ring and separated the tendon on his fucking ankle. Well, actually, no. So I guess I got to revise what I was saying because they wouldn't let go like Akinwande, those fucking guys.
It was
Bad
insane.
matchup.
But take this into account too, how respected Mills was, especially with heavyweights. When Lennox Lewis, Tommy Morrison took place in Atlantic City, Mills, who was primarily, it was a Nevada-based referee, was put in that fight. It wasn't a title fight either, because referees get moved to title fights, whatever. But Mills, who was a Nevada referee, was specifically chosen to referee that fight in Atlantic City because he was known to work with heavyweights and knew that he'd be able to handle shit for that.
Yeah, and I remember him calling that too for Tommy Morrison because Tommy Morrison's eyes started blowing up and he was just getting beaten
Yeah.
up and he was just like, dude, what? No, stop. And remember Tommy's face, like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, get my ass
Yep.
kicked.
And then soon after that, Tommy tested positive for HIV, and then Mills came out too, and he was like, I wasn't that worried, but at the same time, he was bleeding everywhere, and he was like, I just, you know, got to make sure I was okay.
Yeah, man, crazy. Yeah, and it's unfortunate also that he hadn't been on the scene for the last few decades, but yeah, cultural icon in the boxing world, man. Serious. So he'll
Terry
be
and Tommy
missed.
actually had the celebrity death match, his clay statue, I think, at their place in Nevada.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's definitely awesome. Well, he'll be missed, dude. So
Yep.
yeah, rest in peace for sure. And so I'm sure that maybe one day we'll be able to get a hold of one of these kids and get some stories from 'em or something like that. But in the meanwhile, we have some, I guess, not so much stories of our own. We've got some boxing history to talk about. So the subject today was actually somebody had DM'd me and they had suggested this topic, and I suggested it to Aris, and he was like, "Yeah, hell yeah, it's a good topic." I don't know what you would call it. I guess fighters who kind of had the antidote, had the number of some other fighter, or I think the key component for me here, generally speaking, is that one fighter who is not thought of as great as another fighter, but nonetheless still beat them usually more than once. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I don't know how else you would really shorten that, but fighters who had the number of another fighter. Very interesting topic for sure.
Always is, man, because when there's always, it doesn't matter who it is in boxing, you can be the greatest fighter of all time. There's always going to be a guy out there whose style just gives you nightmares for whatever reason. You know what I mean? And even variations of that same style, even might not be the same exact thing, is still going to give you trouble. But it's just that one particular dude that you just can't do anything with him, you know? And even if you might be able to score a victory over him, chances are it's going to be ugly. It's not going to be easy. And anytime you get in there, it's going to be a nightmare. So keep that in mind too. It isn't guys like some of these guys, they've ended up getting victories over their kryptonite more or less, but like um they just something about them, you know what I mean? It's a B-side sometimes. And even so, it doesn't have to necessarily be a guy that isn't as that's not deemed as good as the person that they beat. There's even like, top tier guys that just certain styles they can't do anything with. And that being said, the first one I'm going to bring up is actually like a triple header from the welterweights of the early 2000s. So when you think about it like this, because all these guys had the first one started out is going to be Shane Mosley, Oscar De La Hoya, because Shane basically from the amateurs into the pros always had Oscar's number, regardless of how you looked at their second fight. And then from there, you got Shane Mosley in his kryptonite, Vernon Forrest, who from the amateurs always had Mosley's number, and then in the pros it kind of the same way. And then from there, you got Vernon Forrest and Ricardo Mayorga.
Yep. And then from there, you got Ricardo Mayorga and just giving the guy money at all.
Yeah. Mayorga just became the B side to everybody to kick his ass after
Poor
that.
guy. Mayorga. I hope he's doing well. I truly do. But it really was an interesting, I guess, triangle or however you want to structure that as
Yeah.
far as, that's
It
when we
was an
talk about,
interesting 3-year period from 2000 to around 2003.
and we talk about styles making fights and whatnot, and how you look at these kind of like linear equations, like, well, if fighter B beat fighter A and fighter C beat fighter B, therefore fighter C can beat fighter A, and we already know it does not work like that whatsoever. And when you start mixing and matching, it gets interesting. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what wound up happening. Unfortunately, we didn't wind up seeing a little bit more variation, like at least until later on. We wound up seeing Mosley Mayorga when it was a little bit less important, and Mayorga was a little bit more used up and whatnot. And I guess, yeah, De La Hoya washed Mayorga pretty good. But one of the ones that we were missing, and that I remember they had talked about this fight for like maybe like a year and a half or so, but I just don't think that Oscar De La Hoya was up for it. And that was Vernon Forrest. Like they talked about, all right, well, is Vernon Forrest going to get his shot at De La Hoya? And I know Vernon Forrest wanted it. Of course, why wouldn't he?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Everybody wanted the sweepstakes, but it just wound up never happening, unfortunately. And I don't know that that would have been a very good style for Oscar. And it probably wouldn't have been a very fun fight either.
Nah. Forrest, I mean, he was a good fighter and he was a sharp fighter, but sometimes his style made for ugly fights depending on who he was fighting. The way it all started out, when you think about it, right in around 2000, Shane Mosley. I remember I was on a Friday Night Fights when I found out it was announced that they said that it was like the end of the year of '99, and they said they announced that Mosley was going to be vacating the lightweight crown and looking to move up to fight Oscar. He was going to just bypass junior welterweight and just go straight into the Lions Den. And it's more or less what he did because first, remember, he moved up, and the first guy he fought was Wilfredo Rivera, who was the perennial contender and fought everybody at that point. Very, very hard nosed guy, and gave Mosley a really good fight too. Before Mosley became the first guy to actually knock him out, not just stop him. And then after that, Mosley fought Willie Wise, I believe, right? And
And the Rivera fight was on it was on something weird, like it was on like Fox, or
I think it was on HBO.
was it?
Yeah, Mosley did when he was lightweight champion. Mosley fought on
It
random
might have been
networks.
on like on a weird day or something like that, but I just remember there was something strange about the scheduling. But go ahead anyway.
But yeah, Mosley, when he was a lightweight, he fought on like TNT and like USA and other random networks. But that fight was on HBO, and then he fought Willie Wise, I believe, because Wise had just come off the Chavez victory, a big upset on that one, and so that kind of Wise got massacred against Mosley. So those two victories kind of bounced Mosley into the De La Hoya fight, and that was obviously, as you know, Pat, you were living out there during that time, and that was huge, huge for the West Coast, right?
Man, it was pretty massive. I mean, Oscar De La Hoya obviously big among just in Southern California in general. Like he was already pretty big just overall, but especially big generally speaking among a lot of just I guess the Hispanic population in Southern California. Although I mean we talked about this on a different podcast episode as far as the kind of intricacies of that. But nonetheless, yeah, he was a name. He was somebody everybody knew. You either liked him or didn't like him. I think generally speaking, a lot of people didn't like him. A lot of women liked him, but it was huge. And the fact that Shane Mosley, also from Southern California, and also had kind of like made his name in the gyms, and the reason why a lot of this was interesting with Willie Weiss and Chavez and shit like that was because years before, both Oscar De La Hoya and Shane Mosley had made a little bit of a name for themselves, both of them sparring against Julio Cesar Chavez. Yeah, when he was, I can't even remember what fights,
It was around
Chavez.
19. I want to say it was around like 1990, 91. It was like early.
Yeah, I mean, they were young and
Yeah.
young enough that people were like, oh my gosh, these kids are doing great against him. And it wasn't like everybody was, it's just that they were special talents. And so I remember, obviously not that far back, but in the 90s, that was kind of included in the mythology of both of them or whatever. And so that was kind of interesting to kind of now see that come full circle a little bit and play out. And so you have these guys who were between De La Hoya and Mosley, like these were supposed to be the next Southern California stars and shit. And we talked about that in another episode too, with the teen idols and whatnot, that tied into a lot of this kind of conversation, the Southern California shit. So yeah, it was huge, dude. It was really, really big.
And Mosley as the lightweight champion, no one had seen anything kind of like that since the days of Roberto Duran. I'm not talking about pure dominance because Whitaker came before him and was even more dominant. But I mean, I'm just talking about like just ferocious. Like Mosley made 8 title defenses against varying levels of opposition. Some guys like Jesse James Leija and John Molina, for example, were more elite as opposed to guys like I don't know Demetrio Sabalos or something like that. But anyways, Mosley knocked out all of his competition at lightweight, and he was just a dominant force. And so when he was going to move up to welterweight to fight Oscar, like that was a dream fight for a lot of people, and especially on the West Coast, considering their rivalry as amateurs and
And
you
him
know,
skipping 140 was like,
yeah, oh yeah,
what? That's a big leap.
true. And they just, it looked like he had the build for it too. I mean, we found out also there's a little bit of enhancement later on, but he he filled out well. So when the fight happened with Oscar, I mean, that was one of the great welterweight fights of that era too, man. Probably the best one. What everyone had hoped was going to be was what everyone had hoped would have happened with Oscar and Tito, more or less happened with Oscar and Shane, except there was like no like multiple knockdowns traded or anything like that. They were just toe to toe, man, swinging, but Mosley just was just a little bit faster, just a little bit on the trigger, and Oscar really couldn't complain about the decision. Like, he fought his heart out, and it was a legitimately close fight, but Mosley just, was just a step ahead the whole way. And as he beat him, I don't know how many times he beat him in the amateurs. I think it was like once or twice or whatever, but like it's the same thing happened again that just, the way it portrayed in the pro scene, it looked like Mosley we had his number because it wasn't really a close fight. Like it was close, but it was nothing controversial about it. And that catapulted Mosley right away to the number one spot in boxing right there. He became, Daddy Warbucks. He was the head guy and the biggest star. I mean, the pound for pound best in the world. I wouldn't call him the biggest star. Oscar was still obviously bigger than him, but like Mosley was definitely pound for pound number one. And he solidified that by knocking the living shit out of the guys that he was defending against afterwards too, like Adrian Stone, for example, who just got blasted into another dimension. And I forgot who else he defended against. The guy from Australia, Shannon Taylor.
Yeah, Shannon Taylor.
Maybe someone else too. I'm not sure, but Mosley was just beating the hell out of these dudes left and right. Right. Antonio Diaz was another one. So after that, when Vernon Forrest fight was getting discussed, Vernon Forrest at that point was one of those longtime contenders, and like you kind of alluded to, Pat, no one was really itching to fight him because he long, lanky style, couldn't really get next to him. Very, very good boxer, knew how to hold. Just his whole style was just awkward and hard for anyone to fight. You know what I mean? And he was undefeated for a number of years. Featured a few times on television, but anytime he got featured, it was like he didn't really just spectacularly win. It wasn't like something that you wanted to see him clamoring to see him again. Like the first time he was on HBO was against Vince Phillips, and he won basically every round, but he just didn't look that great doing it either. And then when he finally gets a vacant title shot against this guy Raul Frank, in a fight that Forrest was probably going to win right away, a nasty headbutt created one of the nastiest cuts you've ever seen in your lifetime. So going from there, finally they have a rematch, and Forrest finally becomes champion, and he has to vacate that to fight Mosley because, of course, this is boxing. But he doesn't give a shit. He's getting the chance of a lifetime, and he's getting the chance to fight a guy that he's beaten as an amateur, and he knows he has a style to beat him. And he's been yelling for years that all he wants to do is fight Mosley again because he thinks he has a chance to beat him. So all that even being said, Mosley was still a big favorite in this fight because Mosley just had been looking so dominant in his entire career up until that point. And anyone that was able to legitimately beat Oscar, or peak Oscar at that, was still, going to be favored, and rightfully so, over a guy that previously beat him. But as we watched that fateful night in Madison Square Garden, that clearly wasn't the case.
Yeah, dude, it was a good style, the kind of style where Shane was just not able to get inside and kind of rough
Yeah.
Vernon Forrest up the way he was with Oscar De La Hoya. But also, I think there probably was some element for De La Hoya where he obviously fought Trinidad different from how he fought Mosley. Like he fought Mosley like he knew he was a guy coming up from lightweight and was like, well, then I'm not worried about his punch. And so he just kind of came right at him and was like, all right, then let's scrap. And, at a few points in the fight realized where he, was getting either sped or like getting kind of stung a little bit and going like, oh shit, maybe I shouldn't do that, and wound up kind of boxing on his back foot a little bit. But even so, I mean, whatever excuse you want to make, Shane beat him. And on the other hand, Vernon Forrest just knew that a more linear style where he was just more straight up, a little bit more like, as soon as Shane Mosley would get inside, he was like clinching him or doing something to make sure that he was overpowering him. and Mosley just never really got on track, and especially what was like the second round where he got dinged super bad with that uppercut and then the overhand right. I mean,
Yeah.
or it might have been the reverse, but regardless, yeah, man, that was bad. And so it just looked from then on, literally looked for me from then on that anytime Vernon Forrest just went like that with his right hand, Shane was like, no, not me. So I mean,
I mean, that was a bad knockdown, man. First, Mosley suffers a cut from the headbutt because a lot of Vernon Forrest fights, he always because Forrest would lean in a little bit. He's a tall guy and he had a big forehead, so clashes would occur. And so Mosley suffers a cut for the first time in his career. And once that happens, you can tell he's a little frazzled. But when he goes back into the fray, that's when he set pack. He comes in wow like that, and Mosley just wonky eyed, doesn't know what's going on anywhere. And after that, it's just a rout. Like I don't even think Forrest lost a round after that. So that was a relatively big upset. That was a huge upset. Excuse me. I'm not big like that was a huge upset considering they're amateur and everything like that. Everyone thought that was irrelevant. That Mosley would still come back and do his thing, but nah, that was big. And then they had a rematch, and Mosley was one of those guys we found out later on that he always had some he was always ready to go into the fray. Like even if you beat him the first time, he would always jump in for an immediate rematch. And regardless,
yeah,
get
even to his detriment. Yeah.
totally, like we found out with the Winky Wright fights. But in this one, he performed a little bit better, but the same thing, just that style, he just couldn't do anything with it. And his style just could not do anything with a guy like Forrest, who, like you said, just knew basically, as he even said in the interview after the first fight, all you got to do is just use your jab and a right hand. You could beat a guy like Shane. Just use it smartly. And same thing, anytime Mosley came really close and bullied his way in, Forrest made sure he clinched him up, came out there, boop 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 boop, won another comfortable decision. So as he moves on to fight a new rampaging, freshly minted Ricardo Mayorga, now Vernon Forrest is looked upon as one of the best in the world, and he just signed a massive HBO contract, and he's one of those guys that's on the pedestal. And like what's been going on the past couple of years, all hell breaks loose again.
Yeah, Mayorga had just defeated Six Heads Lewis. I
Yep.
want to say they fought once and it was like a no contest or something like that. And then they fought again. And that was that one where he freezes him up and Six Heads Lewis is like suspended in midair, just like standing there. And then he takes like three more shots and that's it. But like, yeah, excuse me. Mayorga just looked, wild. He looked like a fighter that almost didn't quite belong, who almost kind of just like came upon this world title by accident or something like that. I mean, that's how he looked. Obviously, there was far more to him than that, but he was just so weird, like he was weird. And he did seem like he didn't belong, but it was all wrong for Vernon Forrest all over.
Really was, man. And the thing is that like Mayorga was one of those guys that was easily could goad you into a fight because all the shit talking he would give you and everything like that. And he's wild. You were kind of forced into it. And so more
He's
Forrest
eating a piece of pizza at the weigh-in.
or
Kept
playing
calling Vernon.
yeah, anything.
He kept calling Vernon Forrest my son and shit like that. He kept referring him to my son over there and shit like that.
And
Fucking
Forrest is
guy.
one of those guys that never took shit from anybody himself. He was always kind of had a chip on his shoulder. So yeah, he was feeling salty. And right away, Forrest, like you said, you try to use his boxing skills against that, and it was just irrelevant. It couldn't do anything with a guy like Mayorga who just plowed right through it. And Forrest was a sharp puncher, but he wasn't a hard enough puncher to really get Mayorga's respect, especially back then when Mayorga was still much more fresh. This was way before he got used up. And so in their first fight, Forrest quickly, even though he was landing tremendous punches, he quickly got into a firefight with Mayorga because he had no other choice. He was trying to stay back and trying to
Yeah.
use everything, and Mayorga didn't let him do any of that. So as they get in there and they're fighting on the inside, Forrest is not as competent as Mayorga was on the inside, especially trying to have a wild brawl. So in round 3, that's when you see out of nowhere, Mayorga gets on the ropes and lands that weird clubbing overhand right. Forrest leans back, his eyes roll in the back of his head, and he doesn't like really. He falls through the ropes. Like if the ropes weren't there, he would have went clearly out of the ring. But like, yeah, he was just gone. And that was crazy to see because at that point, no one had really like actually hurt Forrest in a fight, really.
Yeah, he looked really briefly. I think it was the first round. He landed an uppercut on Mayorga that just for a quick second, it was just like, oh shit, like he's going to take this guy out. Nobody knows who this guy is, and he's going to take him out. But obviously, that's not what happened. And yeah, dude, and also produced some fantastic translation from Ray Torres between rounds in that fucking fight, dude. I don't know.
He always had some gems, didn't he, Cat?
Good
Buddy?
lord, dude. Good lord. Almost got killed by Luis Cesar Chavez after the De La Hoya rematch, I think it was, but good
Was.
God. But yeah, I mean, it just he could not keep up with that ferocity, dude, and it was a little bit too much. And if we're being totally fair, he took like an elbow or a forearm or whatever it was after he got knocked down. Like Mayorga, like went kind of into him, like into the ropes with a elbow or whatever. So that probably didn't help either. But either way, he got up and just kind of had a blank stare to him, and got stopped because he wasn't really answering the ref. That's how it goes. You don't answer the ref, you get stopped.
No, and then he tried to protest briefly, but clearly he had no idea what was going on, and his eyes were rolling around still. And then Mayorga had that infamous celebration where Larry Merchant sparks a cigarette for him ringside. And then Jim Lampley goes full on narc ringside after that. It was like, if anyone's watching this and wants to get in trouble, that was all Larry's thing. This had nothing to do with us, all right, guys? And he's like looking around like all paranoid, like, really?
It was him. It was him. Yeah. Come on, Lamps. Well, and so then they actually wound up having a rematch. And I have to say, dude, we talked about this briefly like a week or two ago. And I haven't seen the fight in, gosh, years, maybe 15 years or more. But I remember at the time feeling that Forrest won by like a point or something like that. And I do remember that late in the fight, maybe the 10th round, at one point Mayorga was doubled over from body shots, but beyond that, it's not like Forrest was like dominating or anything. It was just that same thing. Just as in the rematch with Mosley, it was far less eventful than the first fight, Forrest Mosley, that is. And Forrest was able to kind of intimidate him into winning a decision. And Mayorga, many people felt like the same, that Forrest fought scared, that he kind of got intimidated into losing a decision. So, I mean, either way, it became clear that he had a problem with Mayorga. Mosley had a problem with Forrest. De La Hoya, as we also would find out later on, had a problem with Mosley too.
Absolutely, man. What a strange time that was for that 3-year span.
And
Like
and
every time
how
you would think they were going to be like a dominant champion for a number of years, and
yeah,
somehow they got knocked off
every
quickly.
single one of those things like upset the pound for pound list.
Yes, completely.
Like every
Just like
single one of those. Yeah.
and at that point, they were like, "Fuck it, you know what? Just keep Roy Jones up there until further notice."
Yeah, and that the further notice didn't last too much longer either.
Exactly. Yeah, because soon after that, Jones got knocked out himself, and then things just went. And then that's when they were like, "You know what? Just keep Floyd up there."
Yeah. All right, Floyd, you're promoted, dude. You're just stay there for a while. Yeah. Yeah, dude. It's that was a very interesting kind of web of fights there for sure. And on top of that, when you kind of like extend that into the 154-pound and other 147-pound sphere, a lot of guys that a lot of the fighters that those fighters all fought, like bring Vargas in there, some Ike Quartet, etc. Gets pretty fun.
Oh, absolutely, man. It was a fun era, but it's really interesting that like it kind of culminated with Corey Spinks as champion.
Man, that was so weird, dude. I could definitely tell you that's one fight I have not watched back again. Spinks Mayorga. Not going to do it either. Not going
Yeah,
to fucking do it.
I was, you know what, watching it back then, I was happy to see Spinks win because I know that Mayorga was like, even for him, he was talking some really nasty trash, and it was pretty interesting to watch Spinks just style on him
Yeah,
that way.
he said some pretty vile shit.
And I mean, me, man, I'm partial to the Spinks family, so to see like Michael and I think Leon might have been there, and Corey just dance around a guy like Mayorga thought he was gonna walk through him. That was pretty cool. That was one of those Don King marathon cards, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the one where there was like 4 or 5 title fights on that shit. Bad. Just bad. Yeah, not in a good way. Not in a good way at all. But all
You
right.
know, John Ruiz was featured.
Yeah, I think so. And I will pass. just in case his attorney wants to again get all mad at me on the internet. I hope he's not watching because I will pass, bro. That was weird. Anyway, all right. I have a good one. I have a really good one that I think that you probably would not have brought up. At least I don't think.
Okay.
And it goes back too. It goes way far back. And that's Tiger Jack Fox over Jersey Joe Walcott.
Absolutely not. I was not going to bring that up. Good one.
All right. All right.
Oh, hold up. Just recently announced today, Hall of Fame inductee Tiger Jack Fox.
That was partly what kind of sparked my kind of interest here because I was like, wait, doesn't he like wasn't there something with Tiger Jack Fox? And I thought about it and I was like, all right, I know he has some really good wins, but who is he on there? And I looked at his record and I was like, oh shit, dude. He got that Jersey Joe Walcott. He poisoned him. And that's like I said, I guess it doesn't have to be a key component, the whole like, one guy beating somebody who's greater or whatever. It doesn't have to be that way because there are a lot of kind of like we just mentioned, like how do you even figure out all the greatness and all of the guys we just mentioned at welterweight? But point being, Tiger Jack Fox just recently inducted into the Hall of Fame. I think generally speaking, shortchanged as far as giving the credit that he's been given historically, which sucks because he should be better known with his resume. But that being said, earlier on he defeated Jersey Joe Walcott before Jersey Joe Walcott went on to achieve far more. And so I mean we've talked about that in other shows where perhaps fighters should get a little bit more credit when they beat somebody, and then the somebody that they beat goes on to accomplish much more. In any case, Jersey Joe Walcott, far better known, definitely given a lot more credit historically. So, yeah, he was snake bitten apparently.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, like a guy like Tiger Jack Fox is completely unknown today because there's no footage of him, as far as I know, like that's ever that exists. There's barely any photos of him. And despite his incredible record and all the knockouts that he scored, the only title fight that he finally got was late in his career when he was about to retire against a guy named Emilio Patina, um, who is kind of a forgotten champion from the 30s as well.
And
So
there's some crazy shit surrounding that too.
that fight.
There that yeah, yes,
Well,
for
it
sure.
wasn't like that. Wasn't that Tiger Jack Fox? Correct me if I'm wrong. It's off the top of my head. Didn't he just have like recently have surgery or some shit, and like he had no business being in the ring?
Yes, it goes even deeper than that, but yes.
Um,
It's actually could be a subject of one of our true crime shows for sure.
but I
But
know that like that's what it was, and like I don't know if he opened up or some shit happened to him and that like it wasn't supposed to.
he got stabbed.
Yeah. Okay.
He got so I looked it up today because I was like, all right, I need to know more about this because of course I do. And I looked it up, and the young lady who allegedly stabbed him, in one of the news stories I found, it doesn't say it plainly, but what it certainly seems to suggest very strongly was that they that Tiger Jack Fox would not allow this lady to leave his residence,
Okay.
which generally means like sexual assault or something like that. And that's more or less what she alleged. And she stabbed him just below the heart with some shit. And
Jesus.
but like I mean, just barely missed it. And
Mhm.
so he wound up having to go to the Harlem hospital, it said. And yeah, and so then he actually wound up fighting Emilio Bettina. I think it was like 2 months after that or a month after that. But in any case, a very short amount of time after almost getting stabbed in the fucking heart.
Yeah, that's insane.
So
And Bettina
probably not given the best chance to win, generally speaking here.
And Bettina is not a guy that I'm pretty sure he's not in anybody's Hall of Fame or anything like that. But he was a very rugged individual for the time and a person you shouldn't be messing with only 2 months after almost dying on the operating table. So yeah, it's really shortchanged. Just a guy that doesn't get enough respect. And for someone to have Jersey Joe Walcott's number, who was one of the all-time pains in the ass to fight for anybody in history, is pretty impressive in itself. So
Yeah, and like I said, it was like earlier in Jersey Joe Walcott's career, but even so, I mean, it's not like he had no fights. He had like 25 fights or something like that. He wasn't
And
just
that
some.
must have been an interesting contrast in styles because reading about Tiger Jack Fox that I had, he also had a wild style himself that was totally unconventional, didn't he?
Well, yeah, and he was a good puncher. He had long arms. He was kind of spindly,
Mhm.
and he was definitely like he wasn't huge, but he was a pretty well built dude, and he was a good puncher. And so was so was Jersey Joe Walcott for that matter. But they both had like Jersey Joe Walcott was definitely more of a boxer puncher, more of a stylist, and Tiger Jack Fox was a little bit more of like an aggressive puncher, from what I gather.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at his record too, you bring it up, he has scored 91 knockouts and 138 wins. And I guarantee you that's not his full career either.
Well, yeah, and you're looking at a career from 1928 to 1950.
Yeah.
There's a lot of room for no contests and no decisions during that time.
Oh,
Those are the eras where it was far more difficult to actually score a knockout.
exactly. He just, and it's a who's who of like who he ended up fighting and guys like that back then. I mean, all you have to do is just go through his record. It's littered with everybody. From like we said, Emilio Patina, where he lost for the vacant light heavyweight championship, to if you could scroll up and then you see a guy like Tiger Ted Lowry, who one of my personal favorites because he's has roots in the New Bedford area. New England guy, the only guy that went the distance with Marciano twice, and basically fought everybody that you could fight. So those were the type of guys from that era. You know what I mean? A lot of forgotten, respectable names.
And a final note too on Tiger Jack Fox is that even though he did a lot of his fighting out of New York for much of his career, he was from the Pacific Northwest and moved back to the Pacific Northwest, spent a lot of his time up here. And so he wound up becoming something of a fixture among the boxing circles in the Pacific Northwest for a while. So yeah, I guess every so often we do one of these little kind of list shows, and we both come up with some shit that's obscure enough that maybe it'll learn you a little bit. Maybe it'll teach some folks something.
For sure, for sure. And it's just glad because I mentioned something on Twitter earlier, just the last thought on this, that like we talked about the Boxing Hall of Fame and how the voting criteria has changed over the years, where now certain guys that were on the modern ballot but were never going to get inducted got moved to an old timers, and there's old timers and the more modern ones. Tiger Jack Fox and another aforementioned guy from we talked about on the show, Pone Kingpetch, got moved to the old timers,
Yeah,
and
man. I mean, it's kind of a long time coming. Like
it was
it's a bit absurd.
finally for both of them to get in after all these years is remarkable, and it's very good, and it shows that actually the standards of what the Hall of Fame did with the voting criteria works well, because look at how these guys got in now. That was necessary. You know
Yeah.
what I
Well, and I think that what people might be going like, well, what do you mean? How does that though what they shortened the amount of time that fighters could be accepted. Like if you fought after X year, then you had to go, into the modern category. But if your last fight was before X year, then you were going to go into the old timers category. And the
mean?
point being that like there's been so many old timers, there's been so many inductees, period, which is great, not complaining, but there's been so many inductees, period, that one, I think that they wanted to kind of credit some of the fighters who are still alive and still around, could
Yeah.
still be celebrated while they're still here and are still fresh in the minds of the public. But two, when they get kind of nudged into that old fighter or old timers category, it's more likely that they're going to actually get chosen or inducted because so many of those other fighters have already been inducted. So it's like kind of bumps up their chances a little bit of actually getting in. And in this case, that's thankfully what happened. Because Pone Kingpetch, the first ever world champion from Thailand, should have been in already, and then obviously Tiger Jack Fox probably should have been in already too. But I'm happy that he is in now, and it is one of those fighters where like people could stand to know a little bit more, no question.
Absolutely, man. It's very easy now with all the information that there is online, the articles, box rec, everything like that. That this stuff is at your fingertips. You know what I mean? It's at your fingertips. It's very easy to get this
Yeah,
info now.
there's really no excuse at
Yeah,
this
yeah,
point.
there's no excuse to be like, oh, it's too old for me. Oh, nah, man. If you want to find it, it's out there. Okay. Just go to any message board, anything like that. There's a lot of knowledgeable people out there that will give you what you need to find, or just listen to the show, whatever.
For sure.
But keeping up with the deep cuts, Pat. One that I kind of like, I was going through some records and discovered today that I kind of forgot about. Um, Going back to my favorite division, the heavyweights, and that is Jimmy Young and Ron Lyle.
Okay, all right.
So if you think about it, Ron
Pesky
Lyle,
ass Jimmy Young, dude.
Jimmy Young gave everybody hell. Everybody, you know what I mean? But whether you got a decision over him or not, Jimmy Young gave everybody absolute fits. The only dude that was able to knock him into another hemisphere was Ernie Shavers, but Shavers did that to everybody. So that, whatever.
Yeah,
But
there's always that danger there for sure.
oh, Ron Lyle, perennial favorite, top contender throughout most of the 70s, and fondly remembered today for the wars he had with Ernie Shavers and especially George Foreman. Couldn't do a thing with Jimmy Young. Just couldn't absolutely do anything. They fought twice. The first time that they fought was in 1975 in Honolulu, Hawaii, of all places, and Lyle, who had only had only suffered one defeat and was a contender, was still considered a top contender, suffered a wide points loss to Young. And the reason why is because if you look at their styles, Lyle was a competent boxer himself, and as strong as he was and the brawls that he was in and stuff like that, he was a good boxer. Like he had a good jab, he had good skills, but he was also pretty one dimensional. He wasn't very fluid in his combinations. Young, on the other hand, from Philadelphia, very cutesy and just pesky and didn't hit hard, but he just had a style that was a nightmare for anybody. And not only that, he was tough as hell. He had a really good chin, he had a lot of heart, and you weren't going to get him out of there. And so, the first time they fought, I've never actually watched their fights. I've never seen the footage, but just reading about both of them and seeing the photos of it, by all accounts, Lyle just couldn't do anything with him, and even admitted as such. Just that style, just gave him absolute fits.
I mean, a dude who was at least partially a Georgie Benton product, Benton himself was a master strategist and trainer, and you could kind of see that in Jimmy Young's style. And he was a guy who pretty much, no matter who it was that he was going to be fighting, there was pretty much a guarantee that you're not going to look good.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I mean, like you said, aside from those small handful of times where somebody like had his number or somebody just wound up catching him like an Ernie Shavers, there's a really high probability that he was going to make you look bad. And so, because what happens with fighters like that, they have a tough time getting those high level fights, or at least at times when they should get them. They wait them out until they're older, or they can't move as well, or something like that. And that's that was Jimmy Young. He was a guy that not a lot of people were really itching to fight if they didn't have to.
And why would you? Because Young wasn't going to bring a lot of money to the table. He didn't have the best record back then because he would lose fights. He was stopped early on a few times, and he would lose fights that otherwise he might have got the decision, but he got screwed over because he had a negative style, and the judges didn't like it. Fans weren't really a big fan of it, and he got screwed a few times. But there was other times too where he was just so good and just befuddled people that you couldn't deny him anything like that. I mean, Lyle was the prime example of that. George Foreman after that too would be another example. But Lyle was the one that was just kind of like, damn, of all the guys, like Lyle was competitive with everybody at heavyweight. He knocked out Ernie Shavers, he beat Bugner, he beat this guy, he beat that. Gave Ali fits and was beating Ali before he was stopped. Obviously, the back alley war he had with George Foreman, and he mixed it up with everybody else. Like almost everybody, anyone else you can think of, Lyle basically went in with him. Um, and he never looked as just like kind of just out of it and useless as he did when he fought guys like a guy like Jimmy Young. So
Yeah, dude, all but ended George Foreman's first career, the first portion of his career. But what's crazy is that you go on there and he, just like George Foreman, tried to make a comeback much, much later. And George, bro, big George, inspiring everybody and their mom to make a comeback.
well, I mean, yeah, because it's weird because later on, look, Jimmy Young, first off, lasted way too long in his career than he should have. After he beat Foreman, um, he was considered, a top contender in the division, obviously, right up there at the helm. As Ali was still champion, but he ends up fighting Ken Norton in Eliminator, and again, one of those fights that Young gives everybody fits. Norton had another style that was like gave people fits himself. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. But Norton got the decision in the fight that a lot of people thought Jimmy Young might have edged him in. And that wasn't the first bitter pill Young had to swallow, because look at the Ali fight. Even more people thought he got robbed against Ali when they ended up fighting in Maryland, I think it was. So, but that's when the wheels, I guess, started falling off of Jimmy Young, more or less, because after he lost to Norton and that eliminated a fight, eventually Norton got retroactively declared WBC champion. Right after that, Jimmy Young loses twice to at that point the unknown Ozzy Ocasio, and Young's career never really recovered from that. Sure, in the early '80s he scored a few wins, and it looked like he was going to be that guy, that the old veteran that would give everyone fits. But once he lost the decision, I think it was to Greg Page, he became a trail horse, like a complete one, but a guy that was reliable and would go rounds with everybody. Like the only dude back then that really stopped him and cut him up was Jerry Cooney. But Cooney was doing that to everybody, you know. But it's unfortunate because after that, he did. Like if you look at his record and you go in 1982, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, what is he doing fighting up until 1988? There is no reason for him to fight at all like that. This is a guy that fought a who's who of the 70s, took a lot of punishment against those guys, even though he was a cutie. And now he is fighting throughout the entire decade of the 1980s, just getting knocked around by any type of fucking palooka.
Yeah, dude, he fought way too long, and he also ran the gauntlet of the 1970s heavyweights, dude. I mean, there's no joke. You go through that pack of beasts, man. It's pretty wild. And yeah, actually, you could kind of also say that Ozzy Ocasio, in a way, kind of had his number, which I
Yes.
mean
Oh
is
yeah.
more than you could say for most fighters. But also, you mentioned Ken Norton, which is like you could slide that right into the Muhammad Ali shit, dude, because Ken Norton had Muhammad Ali's number too, and or Antidote, however you want to call it, Kryptonite. I Brandon and I did a whole show about the trilogy between Ali and Norton. And so we kind of broke down the scores and stuff like that. If anybody's really interested in getting down to like the fucking nitty goddamn gritty of those fights. But I guess the traditional narrative is that Norton should have defeated him in all three fights, if not at least two of the three. But I mean, yeah, point being that he gave Muhammad Ali total shit, broke his jaw on the first fight, and Ali just could not do anything with that style. Just how Jimmy Young, or Ron Lyle couldn't do shit with Jimmy Young's style. But like, yeah, I guess just to kind of not forget about Ron Lyle in this equation too. Really fun fighter, just somebody who I guess similar to a Mayorga or something like that, just low on that kind of traditional craft or whatever, that style, you know, cutesy style, and somebody who wound up getting handled by somebody who did have the cutesy style. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just funny how all of the styles play together, especially Norton, who had a funky style himself.
Dude, fighting Norton must have sucked. I mean, unless you were a slugger and for whatever reason could walk through him, his style was made. There's certain guys out there who have a style that is just like a nightmare for classic boxers. Like they, for whatever reason, it's gonna fuck with them. You know what I mean? Not only did Ali have a nightmare and couldn't do anything with Norton, really, Larry Holmes struggled mightily with him. Because remember Holmes, even though as you watched his career go on, like in his piston jab and he was more settled down or whatever, he still had like traits of Ali in him, especially early on in his career as he would move and the way he would jab and everything like that. And even if it wasn't the same exact style Ali, carbon copy, there was still similarities to it. And if there are any type of similarities to it, Norton's style is still going to give you fits. And so that, it played out the same way. And yeah, very fascinating shit. Because when you think about it, Norton and Ali, Ali was clearly the greater fighter and the much more um, gifted one too. When it just came to like athleticism and everything else and fluidity or whatever, Norton had that type of style that was just awkward and weird looking and kind of ugly and sometimes made for exciting fights, but most of the time made for weird, awkward fights too. And yeah,
And some of the people involved, dude, Georgie Benton, Angelo Dundee, and then what's that?
Butch at one
Yeah,
point,
and
right?
then Eddie Futch. I mean, some of the, at least on paper, some of the greatest trainers of all time. And then and then you got Pacheco. I'm just kidding.
Just lingering around.
Yeah, I got it. I got to jab at him a little bit. No, but yeah, there's some serious boxing minds behind some of these fighters too, and some classic fights. I guess Norton and Ali are obviously considered like that's probably going to be one of the first fighters that people think of, is that Norton and his style kind of negating Ali's or whatever, or him having that kind of kryptonite for Ali. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that also they're really interesting fights, but I guess not the most entertaining.
Nah, man, and even especially that third fight, which I watched once or so, and I'm like, you know what, that was good. It's just
Yeah, Ali's allowed to do a lot of grabbing and clinching and mauling and messing around in that fight for sure. Like he's kind of he's by the time that third fight comes, dude, it's like he's become the master of like everybody's bought into the Muhammad Ali persona.
mhm, mhm.
Like it's like you don't dare question him. Like nobody's gonna dare disqualify him. Like ever. Are you kidding me? You fucking kidding me? Like he's gonna get away with everything. And so that's the kind of shit was like, he's like sitting there like smacking and backhanding and clinching too much and like talking to the referee and that type of shit where it winds up just being more of like a spectacle than really a fight. And that's kind of how it devolved or whatever. It's like he was buying time. Like he didn't have any legs. He didn't have shit after a few rounds. So he's just like buying time. It's not a good fight. But either way, yeah, the style of Norton's just an absolute fucking nightmare for the guy, for a lot of fighters too. So perfect example there.
And yeah, a great one. And Steve Farhood wrote a very good article right after Montel Griffin fought Roy Jones the first time, because Farhood said that and like ended up being wrong about this, but he predicted, and I think a lot of people, including you and I guess, would have agreed with him that after that first fight, everybody thought that Montel
He
Griffin
looked
style,
bad. Roy
yeah,
looked bad.
yes, very bad, and everyone thought that Montel Griffin style would just give Roy fits no matter what whenever they fought. And
Oh, he had Futch in his corner too,
that's what I was about to bring up, is that Steve brought up a good point where in that article he talked about what Eddie Futch told Ken Norton before he fought Ali the first time, explained to him what to do. How to like back him to the ropes, how to jab with him because Ali wasn't used to people jabbing at him, fighting out of that semi crouch. You
Yep.
catch the club
Countering with the right hand and shit.
counter the right hand and jab with him. By the time he gets to the ropes, he tries to lean back, go to his body, and then you gotta come over the top, and it worked like a charm. And then he kind of said the similar thing to Montel Griffin with Roy Jones. Not exactly carbon copy, but more or less same similar shit. And he was like, yeah, you fight out of a semi crouch, you jab with him. Roy isn't used to people doing that. You jab, move him until eventually he gets to the ropes. By the time he gets to the ropes, Roy has a tendency, as we all saw, he would stand straight up when he would do that. Move to his body, he would have to drop his hands, then you come over the top and start hitting him. Like,
Yeah,
it
he
wasn't
was
like,
really disruptive. Really just
yeah,
like, Roy is a very rhythmic type of fighter. And if you don't let him get into the rhythm, like, and that's what he was doing. He was just every time Roy was going to punch, he was like reaching out to like grab him or, some shit. And I would have agreed with Farhood for sure.
absolutely.
But the
I don't
problem
think I don't
was,
think anybody expected RJ to come out and knock fucking
that's
Harada
what I was about to say, dude. The problem was he woke up RJ. Woke up RJ. Shouldn't have done it.
And also, Montel was kind of a bonehead. He got too big for his britches. He thought he was like super shit after that, and he fired Eddie Futch.
Yeah, that was like a just that sequence of events going from uh well, first of all, yeah, he got hit. Like
Yeah.
Roy shouldn't have hit him. Did the DQ suck? Of course. But dude, you hit him twice while he was down. Neither of them were very hard, and I think Montel Griffin probably acted that shit up, sure. But you can't like act that shit up, but then like talk shit. You can't have it both ways. You know what I mean? If you're gonna like act that shit up, you're gonna be all like you have to go on pre-fight and be like, Roy's a big bully. I just don't like him. You gotta do something, But instead he was talking shit. And so Roy was just like, all right, fine, fine.
And it's crazy too, because like for him to be talking all that shit, because he legitimately went down I mean, Roy hit him after he went down because he
Oh
went
yeah. He had him in trouble.
like he had him in trouble, you know. And if Roy didn't pull a bonehead move and hit him while he was down, chances are he would have stopped him in the round or two after that. So, you
Yeah,
know,
Roy was a good finisher, and if he had a guy in trouble, it would have been bad move if he had just kept his
and he
hands
had
to
finally
himself.
like broken through and like broke him down enough that he was ready to do it. So I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, I think it was like a right hand he kind of caught him with, and Griffin was kind of like trying to roll with it, but it was just like, nah, I got to take a knee, and he wisely took a knee, but Roy very unwisely hit him, dude. It's what winds up happening. So I would have agreed with Farhood because he looked bad up until that point, and it's kind of just like, well, you can't excuse the guy because you lose your cool.
Hmm.
That's part of the whole. That's part of the deal. But yeah, he wound up being incorrect. But I wouldn't have disagreed with him at the time.
Same, same. Um, Another one actually from the '90s now that I thought would be an interesting one because they had a trilogy, but I don't consider that third fight anything, and that's Frankie Randall against Julio Cesar Chavez.
I had that one too.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. No, that's a good one, dude. That's a really good one, especially because I mean, now, especially now that we can go back on BoxRec and now that we have a lot more information overall, we can do our own researching and stuff like that, that we know that there was a far earlier in his career, Julio Cesar Chavez should have a loss, but
Yes,
the local commission bitched out. And, it happens. What are you going to do?
it was a
So what's that?
DQ loss he had.
Yeah, it was some sort of DQ loss, and then like the next day, the commission was like, "Hold on, somebody made a fucking donation." That's pretty much how it goes. So I don't know, whatever. But at the time, Julio Cesar Chavez was definitely marketed as undefeated, promoted as undefeated. And, he'd had a handful of close calls or fighters who had given him a lot of shit, given him a lot of trouble. Obviously, Meldrick Taylor, the first fight was a massive struggle. Now we know it is, a pretty legitimate super fight as far as, I think it was 1990. So it was kind of the start of the 90s and whatnot, and he was still plowing forth, dude. He was still a hero. He was still undefeated, as we all knew, and whatnot. And ran into Frankie Randall, who I think for a lot of people that was a really unlikely person to stop that momentum for a lot of people.
Well, yeah, like you said, man, Chavez at that point had been pound for pound number one, or at least at one or two for a number of years. He was always like looked upon as like Don King's second tier guy when Mike Tyson was still active, but once Tyson went to jail, Don King really catapulted Chavez into his top guy. And also too, after Tyson got knocked out and lost his title, like Chavez was being positioned because when you think about when he first came on in the '80s, after he won his first world title against Mario Martinez in '84, Chavez was just a dominant force, man. You know what I mean? He plowed through the junior lightweights. He moved up to lightweight. When he fought Edwin Rosario, that was
Yeah,
probably
he'd
the
already
best.
been a champ like 5-6 years by the Taylor fight. That's what a lot of people don't understand.
And I mean, look at the guys that he had fought up until that point too, man. That like either whether they were close fights or not, he still had victories over them. I mean, at junior lightweight, he beat guys like Juan Laporte, he beat Rocky Lockridge, he beat Roger Mayweather. He moves up to lightweight. He decimates Edwin Rosario and one of the best performances of the '80s, regardless of a division or fighter. Probably Chavez's grandest night, man. He was incredible that
Yeah,
night.
Rosario is good as fuck too. That's the thing. He's just that he wound up having a few key losses, and so gets remembered unfavorably. But he's a really fucking good fighter.
Rosario was a great fighter and a legitimate Hall of Famer, but he couldn't do a thing with Chavez, who just beat the living daylights out of him. Man, Rosario looked like a fucking. He looked like a person that just came out of a war. You know what I mean? Out of that, like a legitimate war zone somewhere. His face was just battered and swollen and bloodied, and just looked like someone just took a bat to it for 3 hours. But um, look what Chavez did at lightweight too. You know what I mean? Same thing. He was just dominating everyone that there was, culminating. Um, with him beating Jose Luis Ramirez to unify the belts. And then when he moves up to junior welterweight and beats Roger Mayweather for that belt over there too, now same thing. Like Chavez now, as the '90s turn on, he is starting to slow down a little bit. Like the Meldrick Taylor fight, he probably should have lost that if it wasn't for Richard Steele. But regardless, he comes through with that, and he's really isn't the same after that too. Like he hasn't dropped like Taylor has, but there is a slight little step, missing there. We soon found out that he was burning both ends of the bridge, with his outside of the ring activities too, but none of us really knew about that back then. So, he's still dominating and still winning and everything like that. But I mean, he's fighting middling contenders or faded contenders. And the first time where you actually see there's like a whoa, maybe he's not the best fighter in the world is when he fights Pernell Whitaker. And that was what, 93, 94?
I think it was 94, I want to say. Or, no, it might have been 93.
It was 93,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was 93.
And people talk today about how tough it is to make fights because of networks and all that other shit and stuff. And I get it, it is. But you got to think back on this. Pernell Whitaker and Julio Cesar Chavez were two of the biggest fighters in the world in 1993, especially a guy like Chavez. And Whitaker, knowing that he wasn't going to be the A side and knowing that he's won this fight more than anything, even though Chavez fought on Showtime, and Whitaker was, had an HBO deal. Whitaker said, you know what? I'm going to Showtime to fight Chavez. Not only that, I'll go to San Antonio to fight him too because I just want this fight. HBO was fucking pissed about that. Absolutely. Everybody else was just kind of like, yeah, you sure you really want to do that? Because going there is basically a suicide mission. But Whitaker said to himself, if you want to be the best, you got to fight the best. And goes out there and whips Chavez's ass. This wasn't even close. You can't say that. Like the first 2 rounds were pretty good, but after that, Whitaker put on a clinic. Because Chavez moved up to fight him. That's what it was. Chavez moved up to fight him at welterweight, and because Whitaker was the welterweight champ at that point, and Whitaker just did what he needed to do with him. You know what I mean? And that was when people were just kind of like, oh, maybe the wheels are coming off a little bit with Chavez. Like he still whooped Camacho's ass, and still had some dominant performances, but slowly, people were starting to wonder, hey man, maybe he's gonna be ripe for an upset.
Yeah, it was pretty clear that like having gone through, he was in his third weight class, but also the style. That's not a style that tends to last super long overall. Really aggressive, good inside fighter. Even so, he lasted a long time. Overall, he lasted a long time. But yeah, it can't last. That style cannot last. And like you said, getting into lot of not trouble, like not like legal trouble, but just getting into trouble outside the ring. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that does not lend to a long career. So I mean, one way or another, Julio Cesar Chavez was going to run into somebody. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that I think that that's the point, is that not a whole lot of people thought it would be Frankie Randall that he ran into.
No, not at all. And Frankie Randall is one of those guys that he came from um, a hard luck contender. I mean? He is a pro for another one from a long, long time. He turned pro in 1983. And, yeah, first he started out in the Tampa, in the Florida area, fighting in a lot of the back halls in Tampa and places like that. And then he finally moves on and, makes his way over to the Atlantic City area, which was also obviously a hotbed for boxing in the mid 80s, early mid 80s, throughout all of the 80s for that matter. But if you look at the names on his record too from back then, yeah, 1986, he fights Sammy Fuentes, who longtime contender, ends up becoming WBO champion in the 90s, fought a who's who, gave everybody hell. Freddie Pendleton, one of my favorites, basically the poster child for a guy who has a bad record yet becomes a world champion one day. You know what I mean? And these are the guys he has to go through. You know what I mean? Um, one of his first losses to a tough guy named Primo Ramos. But then he's just throughout the 80s and up until like the 90s, he's not getting a title shot. He's known as a perennial contender, but another guy that's also been very avoided because who wants to fight a person like this? You know what I mean? Like there's very little reward fighting a guy like Randall. He's extremely dangerous and he's a very, very good fighter, but like there's no reason to. The only guys that will give him a shot is a guy like Edwin Rosario or people like that. So by the time the 90s come rolling around, he's still plugging along, he's still going through, he's still winning all his fights, but he's not like, he's not really inching closer to anything. And at that point, it looks like he might be one of those contenders who just kind of stay on the USA Tuesday night fight circuit, like the ESPN circuit. Not going to break out of that mold because no one really wants to give him a shot. But after he knocks out Edwin Rosario in a rematch to a fight that he lost by razor thin decision years earlier, that's when he finally gets the shot at Chavez. Because at that point, if Rosario had beaten Randall, then he probably would have got the rematch with Chavez because they were just trying to have a stay busy pay-per-view fight for Chavez as he moved his way to 100-0. You know what I mean? Like, it was an event, but it was just kind of like a meh event. Like, one of those pay-per-view fights that Chavez always had that he would beat his opponent up, but, whatever. So Rosario gets stopped by him. Randall gets a couple of more, stay busy wins, and then he finally gets his date with Destiny. Julio Cesar Chavez, January 1994.
Oh man. And I mean, you know what? It's one of those things where it's like even if that's what you got, even if that's the only thing that you got, like it's pretty fucking good, dude. And on top of that, he was up against it that night. Clearly. He was obviously up against it that night because he still only won by split decision.
Insane. Like, bro, Chavez gets penalized 2 points in that fight. I just had to make sure I double check that. He gets penalized 2 points in that fight, and he gets dropped. That's 3 points lost. And Randall still only wins by a point.
Yeah, it's like, dude, it's the way that sounds on paper is that Chavez whooped his ass. He just had some bad luck in a few rounds when that is not what happened whatsoever. It was a combination, obviously, of Chavez's career and everything catching up to him, but also Frankie Randall seizing the moment. Like he stepped up and he did what he was supposed to do in that moment.
Well, I mean, a lot of guys who have always been denied and they've never really been on that big stage like that freeze up when they finally get their big title fight. You know what I mean? It happens. You
Not the
stay
surgeon.
you stay stuck in a rut for so long and you never really break out of that. And finally, you get put on the stage where you're fighting Julio Cesar Chavez on pay-per-view at the MGM Grand. Like, sometimes you just don't perform to the best of your abilities. You clam up, whatever may happen. You know what I mean? Not Randall. Randall stepped the fuck up and put on an amazing performance. And what made it even more incredible is that, like, it just wasn't that Chavez was having an off night. Randall's style was giving Chavez his fits. Randall was faster than Chavez. He was quicker. He was quicker footed. He was a sharper puncher that night, and he, wasn't afraid to stand there and like trade with him in combination, but move afterwards. Like he just everything he did, he was a step faster than Chavez. And Randall was a sharp puncher too. Like he was just able to take it. And whenever Chavez was able to maneuver him to the ropes and land his, signature body shots or do some work, Randall was able to get out of it. You know what I mean? And I can't say it was a completely one-sided fight. Chavez did start getting some work done once he started warming up, and it became like a war of attrition in the middle rounds. But you got the sense that anytime it looked like Randall was going to start to wilt a little bit, he just came back and started surging even harder. And yeah, like the low blows that Chavez got penalized for definitely fucked up his momentum, and like you see the visible anger on his face when Steele was like, 1 point, 1 point, and Chavez is like, because he feels like he needs to be coddled. He's been taken care of his whole career. He's never lost, and everybody has always made sure that he gets the benefit of the doubt. So now that he's being penalized points and things aren't going his way, he's starting to throw a little bit of a temper tantrum at the same time. When he gets
And on top of that, there's the whole dynamic of Steele for years, even until like now, will get booed at fucking fight cards and shit like that.
Yeah.
But for years, immediately after the Meldrick Taylor fight, people were constantly saying, "Oh, well, Steele's a Don King referee and he's on the take." So it was almost like there was a number of fights after that where he like went the other way. You know what I mean? Like where he was just like, "Oh, like." Almost going against the Don King fighters and shit like that. I mean,
It was
shit was
insane.
wild, dude.
It was insane. And so Randall scores that knockdown, man. It was like in round 11. Like, first off, I think Chavez, was a low blow. He got deducted another point. And then you hear Freddie Pacheco, oh boy, oh boy, oh. And then finally they move back in. And it was the most beautiful two-piece you ever seen, too, because Chavez just walks in, hands down a little bit. Randall probes with a jab and then goes, and that right hand just right through the guard, right? Just clean.
His head snaps. Brum.
It snaps, and Chavez just drops on his ass and just rolls back a little bit. And Steve Albert has a great call because everybody loses it. No one ever would see that. Wow, and down goes Chavez for the first time in his career. And then you hear even Bobby Chez, who usually was kind of reserved, he was getting very excited. Oh, this is incredible! This is incredible! Oh my god, this is incredible! Leave it up to Ferdy Pacheco to have the lay the egg of it, lay the biggest egg, and he goes, "Oh, now it's goodbye title, Bobby." Just all deadpan because first off, in the beginning of the fight, Pacheco was an idiot. At the very beginning of the fight, Albert was saying, Frankie Randall was saying, Albert said that, oh, Frankie Randall says that he has a surprise for us. And Ferdy Pacheco said very sarcastically, yeah, the surprise is that he lasts past 3 rounds with the great Julio Cesar Chavez.
Good one, Ferdy.
Yeah, so
Nappy.
Chavez loses that, and then one of my all-time favorite moments after the fight, Chavez has a complete breakdown, freaking out, and his interpreter, you remember the lady before Ray Torres got involved?
She's talking all sorts of shit. Like she's taking liberties though. Like
she's
not even translating what he's saying. Yeah. She just starts going off on her own.
She is livid. That whole everybody is livid. You know what I mean?
We're suing you. Everybody's getting sued.
You're like, it's not fair. That was a slip. He did not go down. That was nothing like that. Blah blah blah. He wants a rematch. He doesn't understand. He wants to sue Richard Steele. That's all he wants. He just wants she is going the fucking veins in her forehead are throbbing. Chavez is sitting there so pissed off. Everybody is just living. This was not according to the plan. Chavez was supposed to make it to 100-0, and they're gonna have this big thing, and yada yada yada. And Frankie Randall fucked their plans up. So, of course, they were gonna have the rematch. And that was on that famous card, and what's still considered today probably the greatest pay-per-view, top to bottom. I'm not saying what actually occurred in the ring, but top to bottom, the card is still considered the holy grail, and that's Revenge the Rematches. And
and once again, they're just Frankie Randall's up against it, dude. Once again, Frankie Randall, it's not like it's not like he's dominant or anything like that, but it looks like he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. Accidental headbutt, and he winds up, the difference in the fight winds up being the deduction from the WBC, which is some people don't even know about this fucking rule, because it's seems to be arbitrarily enforced. You've probably seen it enforced 3 times total in a fight, where if there's an accidental headbutt and there's a WBC title on the line, that there's supposed to be a 2-point deduction from the headbuttee.
It was absurd. And not only that, Randall was whooping on him in that fight too. Regardless of what the score says, Randall was winning that fight, and Randall was on his way to potentially even stopping Chavez. He was doing good. And then that stupid rule. It has to be one of the dumbest, if not the dumbest fucking rule that ever existed for WWE.
It makes no sense.
An accidental.
Yeah. And so then they go, and so he loses a technical decision where it's just, dude, so limp, bro. So stupid, fucking weak.
And clearly that was made to make sure that he wasn't gonna, that Chavez was gonna get the belt back as quickly as possible. That's all that was.
Yeah, well, at least Frankie got his rematch.
Yeah, right.
Or rubber match, whatever. But yeah, dude. But either way, I think that it went to show that Chavez was obviously slipping, sliding clearly, but Frankie Randall deserved better than what he got, dude. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, here, let's see. Got time for a couple more. I think I have a really good one here that you might not have brought me. I don't know. Knowing you, actually, you might have brought this up, but fighting Harada over Eder Joffrey.
It's a good one. I didn't think of that. Good one.
Because it's still pretty high level. Oh shit, there's some shit going on in New York tonight.
I don't know. Something weird I just heard outside. We're good.
Yeah, there's always some shit going on over there, man. But yeah, Eder Joffrey, obviously one of the greatest fighters from South America, if not the greatest, clearly the greatest Brazilian fighter of all time. Just high level fighter overall. One of those guys that we've talked about fighters from other eras that would fit in from any era just fine. He's one of those. Watch him on tape. He looks great. Absolutely fantastic inside fighter, good punching power, good skills overall, and also from pretty much all accounts, a super nice guy, and a very dominant bantamweight called the Golden Bantamweight in Brazilian Portuguese, because he was an incredible bantamweight. But unfortunately, he ran into a guy in fighting Harada who just it was just for whatever reason the style, and also probably the fact that it came toward a fairly long run, the end of a fairly long run for Joffrey too. That fighting Harada just he just had his number. It was just a style that Joffrey could not overcome twice.
Well, Harada was a tornado, bro. That's the one thing about him. You know what I mean? It's like, again, you talk about like a classic boxer, and a guy like Joffrey was a classic boxer. And then you have a guy like Harada who was short, stocky, just a fire plug, and threw a bajillion punches at you. It wasn't particularly a hard hitter, just a guy that overwhelmed you. And if you couldn't hurt Harada, and most people couldn't, it's going to be hard to keep him off you. You know what I mean? And yeah, Joffrey, again, like one of the greatest of all time, man. A beautiful practitioner and a guy that really solidified his legend status by retiring after the two Harada fights, coming back as a featherweight and then becoming champion again, and then dominating that division again for a few years before finally retiring and saying enough is enough. Like,
And yeah, just easily one of the all-time. However you feel about him as a fighter or his rating overall, that's fine. I'm not going to argue, but that what he did, retiring and going away, and then
yeah,
coming back and fighting at that level that many years later is just like nobody
against a
does that.
stacked featherweight division too. It wasn't like he was
Yeah,
coming
nobody does that.
at all. So that shows you the legend of fighting Harada himself. You know what I mean? And how great Harada was, that he was the only person to get 2 wins over Joffrey.
Yeah,
They're
amazing
good
shit.
fights, man. They're great fights to watch. Like, they're very, very, and they're available. I think they're on YouTube.
They are, and actually, just as kind of like a icing on the cake to the whole thing, uh, before Eder Joffrey died recently, he was able to, I think that he was able to meet up with fighting Harada again. But I know for sure that they were able to like they zoomed a whole bunch of times and stuff like that, and wound up sending some stuff to one another, kind of connecting once again before Eder Joffrey died. And we're friends, throughout life, even though one Japan and the other in Brazil. So yeah, pretty amazing though, especially when you consider the fact that Joffrey did come back later on. So it wasn't just like some anomaly, like he was shot or like something like that. Fighting Harada was just a serious pain in the ass.
Well, yeah, Harada himself is considered maybe the greatest Japanese fighter in history, and definitely in the discussion of greatest Asian fighter in history for that matter. Like
Absolutely.
Harada was an incredible, incredible fighter himself, and he almost became a 3 division champion too afterwards. When he got robbed for the featherweight crown. So, and this was back in the original 8. You know what I mean? It wasn't like he was jumping to junior divisions or anything, because fucking who knows how many straps he would have won. But yeah, Harada was just a buzzsaw, and one of those guys that, like, if you couldn't keep him off you, chances are before you even realize what the hell happened, you'd be down a number of points because he just overwhelmed you like a buzzsaw. And Joffrey would adjust. Like in their first fight, Harada overwhelmed him for the first few rounds, and Joffrey had to come up from like a major points deficit. And it certainly didn't help him that the fight was held in Japan either. But
Yeah, the first fight's pretty hotly contested. The second fight, I think it was a little bit more of a struggle for Joffrey, but
mm,
but yeah, both of them are definitely well worth watching. Joffrey, just in terms of skill, is he's a nice fighter to watch. He's easy to watch. So yeah, they're good fights for sure.
totally. So yeah, that's a great one, man. That's not one I was actually going to think about bringing up. But my last one actually was one that I was like thinking about today. And as I bring up his record, that is the Cincinnati Cobra, Ezra Charles and Archie Moore.
All right, dude, hell yeah.
Yeah.
And that fits too, because especially because even though Ezra Charles in recent years has been getting more and more credit, more and more recognition,
Mhm.
just historically he's been pretty under recognized and unheralded. And especially because it's like, the recognition is that he was heavyweight champion, which, obviously no argument. He held it from like 49 to 51 or whatever. But even so, his light heavyweight run is like one of the greatest runs in the history of the sport. Like like the amount of great fighters he fought at light heavyweight, and at the time that he fought them and beat them is just like, dude. I mean, fucking Charlie Burley the night before high school graduation.
I know, dude, man. Charles was a freak of nature back then, bro. And then, like, I love his yearbook where it talks about how, he loves the ladies and he does this and that. And then I forgot what high school he went to, but that the end of it says that whatever high school it was, it says that's their gift to the boxing world. Ezra Charles.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, it was legit, dude. Extremely legit because he's a very unheralded fighter, even still, despite the fact that he's gotten far more credit. Because Archie Moore, a character, we've talked about him on the Greatest Punchers show that we did. Just a lovable guy, celebrity, wound up being in movies later on, facing some of the greatest fighters of all time, and also some, really big name fighters later on too. So yeah, it's easy to kind of lose Ezra Charles to Archie Moore there, even though Ezra had him.
And that's the thing is that as a kid, when I was first learning about this and learning about the history of boxing and all that, I never knew Ezra Charles was a light heavyweight. Hell, I didn't know Billy Conn was a middleweight. I didn't know Gene Tunney was a light heavyweight. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you learn about this stuff, and then I learned that wait a minute, not only was Ezra Charles a light heavyweight, but he was considered the greatest light heavyweight that ever lived
Yeah,
potentially.
and without even winning the title, like
Without even winning the
what?
title. You're like, okay,
How
what is
could
this?
that be?
And then you look, and then you find out that he fought Archie Moore 3 times in the 1940s, and this is way before Moore even became champion, and whooped his ass each time, as long with everybody else that he was fighting at that point. So you got to remember is that like Ezra Charles is not usually considered a charter member of Black Murderers Row so much. You know what I mean? He fought all those guys, but he wasn't like,
It's almost like both Archie Moore and Ezra Charles. Sorry to cut you off,
oh, you're good.
but it's almost as if, they both were considered part of that kind of Black Murderers Row group, but
Mm-hmm.
then they both almost lost that distinction. I think Ezra Charles partially because he started getting backed by money, but also Archie Moore later on when he won the light heavyweight championship and got far more opportunities. And I think that seemed to be the key with a lot of the idea behind the Black Murderers Row was that these were fighters who had never gotten the opportunities, even if earlier on they were kind of considered part of that group. But yeah, like, I mean, but you look at both of their resumes and they fought like everybody.
Yeah. Everybody, man, back then. And if you look at the guys that there were, like Charles didn't beat everyone at Black Murderers Row. I remember after Charles had beaten Archie Moore and he had beaten Charlie Burley, and he looked upon that like he was, going to plow through everybody else. My personal favorite of the group, Lloyd Marshall, fought him and whooped his ass like really badly. Um, and
Well, it's
that's
like you
how it
fight
goes.
enough of those guys, somebody's going to
Yeah.
beat you.
And yeah, Lloyd Marshall was probably the quirkiest one out of the group too, with the most peculiar style and just a murderous puncher though that you just did not want to um try to mess with. If you didn't come on your best behavior, if you didn't come in your peak training or anything like that, chances are Lloyd Marshall was gonna knock your head off and dance around while doing it. So but yeah, that was it. But the one dude out of the and same thing, Archie Moore had lost the decision to Charlie Burley. He, fought guys like Jack Chase. He lost to Eddie Booker. Like Moore didn't really have a good record against most of Murderers Row. Like he beat homie.
Especially middleweight.
Yeah, even the guys that weren't a part of that group, like the White brothers there, Shorty and Big Boy Hogue. I think Shorty Hogue beat him a couple of times too, wasn't it? So like Moore was really in his development back then. That's when he was like really learning because he was going through the wins and losses and like, picking things up and learning here and there and going through the shit. But um at this point they fought 3 times. The first 2 times that Charles fought him, he won decisions. And then in their third time, and it was the time that Charles knocked him out. And that was the one that they said was probably the most exciting one out of the group because they traded rounds in that one, and they were trading bombs and everything like that. And when by the time Charles knocked him out in round 8, Moore had him on the verge of a knockout himself.
Yeah, dude. And it's hardly you can't exactly fault the guy, fault either of them actually. I mean, they're both incredibly great fighters and keeping each other close, especially in that one fight. But it's just that Ezra Charles, for whatever reason, that mixture of like speed and sharp punching just
Mhm.
was too much for, I guess, I think it's just too much for Archie's style, which was more laid back overall. He was more like, all right, you come to me, I'll counter your ass and I'll counter the shit out of you. But if you know how to deal timing wise with a counter puncher, they won't touch you. And you're going to force them out of their comfort zone. And that sounds like what happened with Ezra Charles, is he just overwhelmed Archie Moore and was too much for him. But again, no shame.
Ezra Charles was, yeah, and that's the thing. We found out Ezra Charles was basically too much for everybody. Like he's one of the greatest fighters that ever lived, and it's so sad what ended up happening in his life later on because he was young. He was only in his mid-50s when he died of Lou Gehrig's disease.
ALS, yeah. Lou Gehrig's disease, yeah.
And chances are, the way it's looking at it, he probably was already suffering from the very early effects of it while he was still competing in his career. Because he was talking about it too. People talked, like his wife and others would talk about how he would say his leg was feeling numb or he felt like he was draggy or a little bit something, but he would just ignore it, you know what I mean, and not think anything of it until eventually things started escalating.
Yeah, and again, I mean, just kind of a hallmark of just about any fighter's career is he fought too long. He went a little bit too high in weight. He started as a middleweight. He was not a massive guy. He was like my height. He was not a super tall guy. He wasn't real big frame wise either, but still went to heavyweight and was an effective heavyweight. And he also like took Marciano to the fucking limit, bro. Like, not like, a lot of people will. I'm not trying to stick up for or against Marciano. It's not about that, but a lot of people will dismiss and say like, well, he only fought old guys and light heavyweights, and yeah, I mean, whatever, fine, dismiss him how you want, but like Ezra Charles was fought for his life. Like he was fighting like it was a mad rabid animal in there. So I mean, it's
unfortunate. Like the full fights, I think for both of them don't even exist, right? It's only partial ones for both of them.
Yeah, there are a couple rounds. The first one, especially, that was one of the first fights that I remember watching that was like an old fight. And I remember being like, oh my God, this is fucking vicious. But now the versions they have out now are missing like 3 or 4 rounds or something like that. But even so, they're really good.
Oh no, it was great, man. That first fight, because a lot of people thought Charles was past it and would just get plowed through by Marciano, and not Charles. Gritted down, took a lot of punishment himself, but that was one of the classic great heavyweight fights you can find. And I think that was the only time Marciano went the distance in a title fight, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So,
and the second one was where he was like almost lost his face.
Bro, I mean, like, there's no way a punch can do that to a nose. So we know that now, because some people thought that was initially a punch, and it can't be. There was an absolute chunk missing right here, which is so ghastly to look at, even black and white photos. Imagine if that shit was colorized. And
it would have been stopped immediately now.
Yes,
like it just wouldn't even.
It was like, what was it, an elbow? I think that Charles caught him with something like an errant punch.
Something like that.
Something
clearly. Yeah, it was like one of those where he like hit, but then like followed through with an elbow or something like that.
And
Ugh.
I remember like Marciano saying too that like, well, no, if you watch it, because they remember on ESPN Classic and other stuff, Marciano had those shows, like used to host those shows where he'd watch like old fights.
Yeah.
And he was watching his with Charles, and he was like commentating his own stuff, and he was talking about it. And at first he was saying that Ali Colombo and was it Charlie Goldman and them were saying, oh, don't worry about it, it's fine, everything's good, just a little scratch, go out there. And Marciano no, and he was like, I'm bleeding bad. He was like, no, it's a scratch. And then he comes back into court. He was like, my corner tells me the truth. They can't stop the bleeding. I gotta go out there and knock him out. Oh no.
Yeah, he had the greatest commentating for the ones that he did. Like where there was I think they showed one where he dubbed over Archie Moore versus Yvonne Durrell, I think it was. And he's sitting there and he's like commentating. He's like, I think Archie's got him now. Go get him, Archie. You got him. Shit like that. It's hilarious. But yes, dude, that was absolutely fucking brutal. And I mean, Ezra Charles, he almost did it twice. 2 fights, he almost did it. And at that advanced stage in his career, that shows how great he was. But going back to what you're talking about, that probably was a massive contributing factor to how he ended up, unfortunately.
I mean, it's sad because Archie Moore had a longer career than he did. Archie Moore started his career in the 30s and ended his career in the mid 60s, early mid 60s. Ezra Charles started his career in the beginning of 1940 and ended had basically himself a 20-year career to end in 1959, 1960, and it's like, you know, I don't know. He just by the end, unlike Moore, who was just an anomaly in itself for whatever reason, and was able to like take the punishment he took early on in his career, but like still just survive and just linger and do whatever he did. Charles didn't like his style. Just he took punishment. Like he became a trail horse, and it wasn't like a good thing either. Like after the Marciano fights, like his career really nosedived after that, and then like guys that he shouldn't have lost to, he was losing to regularly and getting beat up badly for it too. Like a lot of guys were knocking him out then, and you take enough of that punishment, and eventually, it is what it is, and it's just like
Yeah.
it's really sad, and you see that that really really tragic commercial that they put out in the 70s right before he died, and you see Charles in the wheelchair and
Yeah.
he can't move and everything. That's just fucked up, man.
Yeah. That ALS commercial. It's
Mhm.
fucked up, dude. Yeah. And I mean, he obviously was a more extreme example of how a fighter can end up, but it was sad, especially given his age, that he
He
didn't get
died
to
at
enjoy.
53 in 1975, so 53 and 75, he would have been 63 and 85. So like he should have still been alive in the 90s. He still should have been one of those guys that had a chance to visit the Hall of Fame,
Yeah.
signing autographs, and mingling with fans and talking old war stories with Archie Moore and Jimmy Bivens and other contemporaries of his time. Joey Maxim, guys who did have a chance to visit the Hall of Fame. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Totally.
It's tragic.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, but he did have Archie Moore's number. I
Yeah,
mean, like, that's
yeah. And I
that's
thought
one
that
thing
would
that we
be
can give to him.
and there's other guys, and there's other examples too we could have brought up. Like there's Iran Barkley to a degree.
That's a
Haven't
good
talked
one. Yeah.
about him. If you want to go really, really deep back with some deep cuts, you can go with Stanley Ketchel against Maurice. What's his last name?
Oh gosh. I
Maurice
was
White.
just looking at it
I was about to say
earlier.
Maurice White, but that's the dude from Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Oh,
Maurice Thompson.
yeah. I was just going to say we were talking about it earlier.
Yeah, Maurice Thompson, or Jack Dempsey with Fat Willie Meehan. Like, there's always a guy out there that just give you fits. George Benton made a good comment. Made an interesting comment in his book that Dave Anderson wrote about the cornerman, and
Mm,
he said that George Benton always said everything is about styles. It doesn't matter if you're the best fighter in the world. There's always a style out there that will give you fits. He was like, that's what happens in boxing is that there's certain styles that just can't deal with. And he made an example. He said, look at the lightweight champion Jimmy Carter. He said Carter could make a title defense and win it and do something like that, but then he'd lose a non-title fight to an absolute scrub bum because that guy just gave him fits for no other reason. I suspect, in my opinion, that there might be more than that going on considering the time period, but
mm-hmm.
he makes a good
100%.
point. He makes a good point. You know what I mean?
No,
Styles.
it does though. It still holds up. And because it holds up because another lightweight from not too far before then, Lou Ambers actually another example would have been Lou Jenkins versus Lou Ambers. Lou Ambers just couldn't do anything with it. Lou Ambers super great fighter. Had a style that was they called him the Herkimer Hurricane because he had a very active, busy style. He and Henry Armstrong made for two incredible fights. But Lou Jenkins, for whatever reason, not incredibly skilled guy, but the
Not at all.
Sweetwater Swatter they called him, and he could fucking punch. And you
He'd
could
be a great podcast subject because that dude lived a wild,
he
wild
did
life.
served in the army, fought in World War II. I mean, like there was actually I think I have the book, pretty sure I do. But
Notorious
then
drinker,
what's that?
notorious drunk.
Yeah, yes, he was a big drinker. Yeah, and he had the fucking kryptonite for Lou Ambers. So that's another example we could have brought up. But in any
Zivic
case,
had one for like Fritzy Zivic and Henry Armstrong. Yeah, there's a lot of
it
them.
there's a whole bunch of examples, especially if we go back far, far. But no, I thought we covered a pretty good base overall. It's a good starting point. But dude, I appreciate you doing your homework like always. Appreciate you bringing on the boxing history discussion. Always bringing the knowledge, man.
Yeah, man, it's always a pleasure, and as always, I hope everyone enjoyed it. So,
Totally. Well, if you did listen in, thank you so much. I hope you did enjoy, but subscribe on whatever podcast app you might listen in through or leave us a comment, a little rating. If you watch on YouTube, thank you as well. Subscribe there, leave a comment. We'll try to reply at some point. As far as social media goes, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is on Facebook and Instagram, but also it's on Twitter, just like we are individually. My buddy Aris here is on Twitter as Punch Zone Aris. If you want to check out his fine collection of boxing t-shirts, it really is a fine collection of boxing t-shirts. I'm not kidding. I'm also on Twitter. See, he's got one on right now. I'm also on there as Patrick M. Connor. So say hello. I'll say hi back. And Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, everyone.
Later, buddy.